Hi, everybody. Sorry I'm a little late today. Facebook is requiring my Chrome to be updated to a beta version, so I had to go through that process. Sorry I was late. Facebook required an update to my browser. I don't love that they're forcing me to download a beta version of Chrome, but I wanted to be here, so I made it happen. So I apologize for getting started a few minutes late here, but I think we'll make it up. So a couple things I wanted to start by talking about today. Last week, there was an update to the state of emergency and our presidential primary. So our state of the emergency has been extended until the end of the month of May. It previously was May 15th at the earliest, but it's now been extended to the end of the month. And there were also changes that came through for the presidential primary. So if you remember, our presidential primary was supposed to be April 28th. It was pushed back to June 2nd, and now it's been pushed back again to July 7th. However, what is happening as part of that change is that every registered voter will receive an absentee ballot application by mail. So the Board of Elections is going to send you an application to get an absentee ballot, no matter what. Really important, application for a ballot. And that's the important distinction. You're not getting the ballot, you're getting an application to request the ballot. So there's still going to be this kind of two-step process where you'll receive an application, you'll say whether you want your absentee ballot, and you'll send that back, and then you'll get your absentee ballot, you'll be able to vote in the presidential primary. If you want to avoid that, you can still request an absentee ballot directly online by going to ivote.de.gov so that you can get that ballot more easily and directly. While this is a push in the right direction to have every eligible voter get this application, I'd much prefer to see every eligible voter get the ballot. It's still kind of this two-step process that's going to cause some people to fall off and maybe not have the opportunity to vote. Or it's just a little more complicated than if you were just given your ballot directly, which I would prefer to see. As a reminder, this is not our election. This is still the presidential primary. We're not sure what's going to happen with our election on September 15th yet. So we will obviously keep everyone posted as we learn more. But right now we're only talking about the presidential primary that is now moved to July 7th. Some other things that have kind of come about this week are that people who were self-employed contractors, so that's people who maybe were getting a 1099 for their work, maybe running their own business, driving Uber, driving Lyft, door dashing, whatever that might be. Previously, those people did not qualify for unemployment insurance. But as a part of the CARES Act that was passed back in March, those contractors and self-employed people do qualify for what's called the Pandemic Unemployed Assistance. So if you've seen someone refer to PUA, that is the money that is now going to be made available for people who otherwise didn't qualify for unemployment. So as of this week, today, May 11th, this week, in Delaware, you can now apply for those benefits. So you can start registering. There's a few steps. So I kind of want to talk through the steps that you have to take to do this. First, you apply for the traditional unemployment benefits, and you can do that by going to ui.delawareworks.com. So you start there. You apply for those benefits. You're going to get denied. And I know that's frustrating, but this is kind of the process it needs to go to. So what's going to happen is you'll get a denial that says we couldn't find sufficient wages. Once you get that denial, you'll continue through the process and you should receive a confirmation letter that says you're going to get PUA benefits. So that is the letter that should start coming out this week. So if you have already applied and were denied, you should start to see that letter coming through. If you haven't applied yet, now's the time to do it and get that denial and then get the confirmation letter. Once you get that letter saying, okay, you're actually getting the PUA benefits, you can, there'll be information about where you can go to log in to access the system where you can see your benefits and claim that assistance. So again, it's a little bit of a complex process, but at least we are now able to get assistance to people who were working as contractors or self-employed. So if you run into any issues with that, please reach out. We can always try to help. I know that that was something that came up while I was phone banking this weekend. I spoke to a couple people who had been contractors who haven't been working for the last month or so. And I was able to share information with them about how to get that done. So if there's anything you need, as always, feel free to reach out. So something I wanted to start with, kind of questions that I've gotten throughout the week or offline before this. So this one is, I saw you had mentioned that you don't think Senator Coons' pandemic response and opportunity through National Service Act fits the needs of unemployed workers, specifically their economic needs. Could you talk more about why you think that? Yeah, so this is something that we've talked about. And the issue is that when you try to replace work and people's salaries or wages that they were receiving with something like a national service program, you're not actually replacing the compensation that they were likely getting. The money that you will make for full-time work in one of these service programs is as little as $12,000 or $13,000 in a year. That is about minimum wage, and you're not guaranteed housing through this program, so you still have to find housing. You're not guaranteed healthcare through this problem. So if you had a job that you received healthcare, this is not really going to be an adequate replacement for you. And we heard stories from people when we shared our takes on this that they felt the same way. So my feeling is that while national service is fine for those who want to participate in a service program, it's not actually a replacement for employment. And we need to ensure that we are actually paying people living wages that they can survive on, rather than seeing a moment like this as an opportunity to exploit labor from people who are going to be really potentially desperate for work. As I mentioned, when we shared about this, we got some stories in response, and I did want to share one thing that someone said to us. So it was a woman who responded to us about her experience working with AmeriCorps, and she said, "I loved my AmeriCorps experience, which is one of those national service agencies, but I barely got by with the pay. It was a full-time position. I had to work a second job while doing it, and I had to use food stamps and Medicaid. I also had to commute 30 to 60 minutes depending on the snow because I couldn't afford to live in the town that I worked in." And that is the type of experience that is just not going to be enough for people to get by right now. There is work that needs to be done, absolutely, but we should be prioritizing paying people living wages for that work rather than trying to force them to get by on stipends that they're not actually going to be able to survive on. So that's my feedback on that proposal. So I got an email that had a few questions in it. So I'll try to address each of them. One was, what gives you the idea that our oceans are rising? They are rising. This has been tracked by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's been tracked by the National Ocean Service. It's not just an idea that I've come up with. It's something that has been proven and is actively happening. If you live downstate near the beach, you might be seeing the effects of it already as ocean waters continue to infringe on dunes and on roads and on people's homes and land. What's particularly concerning about it is that not only are things rising, but that rate of rise is continuing to increase. So that is absolutely happening. It's not just something that I'm making up. The next question in that email was, why do you think our schools need more money? I think that when we see schools that are closing because they can't be funded, when we see in Delaware that we have to try to pass referenda to actually be able to deliver the services that students need. This is something that I talked about on an Instagram live that I did over the weekend. We've got Christina School District who's going to try to pass a referendum because if they don't, they're going to have to cut positions. And it's positions that they need. It's not that they no longer need to deliver the services of those teachers or those aides or support staff. It's that they can't fund them. We currently have schools that even if they aren't trying to raise money right now, we know that our classroom sizes are too big. Our buildings, a lot of the school buildings themselves are in poor condition and need to be repaired. We have situations where we don't actually have enough counselors or nurses or social workers or aides to actually deliver the services that students need. We should be providing students with meals while they're in school. It's compulsory. They need to be there. We should absolutely be feeding them while they are there. And then we look at things like supplies. We can't even provide students with the supplies that they need to get the education and do the work that they need to in the classroom. We have students who can't afford to take advanced placement courses or SATs or ACTs that allow them to get higher education or college credit and move forward and take advantage of opportunity. We have teachers who aren't paid nearly enough for the work that we do. So I think it's particularly evident that our schools need additional funding and that they are the type of thing that we should absolutely be investing in. This is investing in ourselves, investing in public goods. These are assets that we should be building up, not looking to tear down. And the third question that was in that email was, do you have any thoughts about controlling spending and keeping Delaware an attractive place to retire? So I'm running for federal office, so I don't necessarily would not have jurisdiction over things like the state budget. That would be happening at the General Assembly level and the state level, or from the governor's office and the budget that they put forward. However, I think that what we should be doing at a federal level is investing in the safety net programs that will actually allow people to live comfortable lives and decent lives from birth to death. We don't want to have a situation where from one state to the next, the ability to survive is dramatically different based on the decisions that individual governments have made. We should have a federal network that says we invest in Social Security, we invest in our healthcare, we invest in our education, because those are the things that actually make people's lives better. And it will take some of the pressure off of individual states and not require them to deliver those services for every single person in the state. It also means when you do those things at a federal level, they become portable. So if you're like me and you were born in New York, but you moved to Delaware, that doesn't necessarily mean that your entire prospects of what your retirement would be like or what your healthcare would be like. Ideally, you would be creating a system that means anyone can live anywhere comfortably because it's done in a universal way. So next question. I've read there have been a ton of hospital closures in recent years, which has made coronavirus treatment particularly difficult in some parts of the country. Do you have thoughts on how we can fix this problem? I absolutely have thoughts about this. I think that when we talk about universal healthcare and Medicare for all, we absolutely need to also be talking about investment in medical infrastructure. So right now we have decisions being made about where hospitals are located and what services they offer based on profits, based on how much money can be made. And rather than being based on need or being based on where people are and the types of treatments that they're going to need. Would we rely on things like endowments from very wealthy people or gifts from very wealthy people because someone wants to be able to put their name on the wing of a hospital? That's allowing individual private citizens to sort of decide what a hospital looks like, what types of services it delivers, rather than the actual needs of the constituency that it would serve. This questioner is absolutely right. In the last, I think, 10 years or so, we have seen that over 100 hospitals have closed, particularly in rural areas. And rural areas are being hit particularly hard by this because in rural or lower income areas, it's harder to actually make money on delivering health. There's fewer people. There's potential that if they're lower income, they're not paying for the more elective surgeries that really drive profits of hospitals right now. And that is what you're seeing happening even in the midst of coronavirus, is that when we have hospitals that are looking to make a profit and are funded that way, then we're actually seeing nurses, doctors, support staff lose their jobs right now in the middle of a pandemic because the elective surgeries that funded their positions are no longer taking place. So that is the type of counterintuitive situation that we are creating by having our hospitals tied to a profit motive. So that is something we absolutely have to change. I think not only are we talking about moving away from private insurance, we need to be talking about how do we also fund investment in medical infrastructure. Right now there's an incentive to build a hospital or medical center that does these procedures that will be paid for by private insurance because private insurance will pay higher rates. So that is, again, an incentive that we need to change and ensure that rather than forcing hospitals to try to make money off of given procedures, they're measured in a different way. The metrics of a hospital's success should not be based on a balance sheet. They should be based on how healthy the community that it serves is. And right now, that is simply not the case in a lot of places. So that is what I believe needs to be part of a Medicare for All plan, is removing that profit incentive from hospitals, ensuring that there's more, frankly, planning that happens about where hospitals need to be. It can be more formulaic. It can be based on these people who need to be served. They're X number of miles from a hospital, and we need to have something here to serve them. We here in Delaware have only one level 1 trauma center. And so if you get in, let's say, a really bad car accident downstate, you need to be transported all the way upstate to get the services that might save your life. And when you're talking about that amount of time, like minutes matter in these really traumatic and catastrophic accidents or issues. I mean, I remember when we were canvassing last winter, I talked to a father who believed his son ended up dead from a gunshot wound because he was taken to hospital in Wilmington and then needed to get transferred to the hospital to get transferred to Christiana. And had Wilmington been able to treat him, had they had the trauma center that he needed, the father believed he would have been alive. So those are the types of things that are happening when you don't have hospitals in places where they're needed or have the services that are necessary in the places where they're needed. So someone's asking, what do you think about Chris Coons being considered for Secretary of State? For anyone who doesn't know, that came up in some reporting, and then his name has been floated that if we have a Biden administration going into 2021, that Chris Coons would potentially be Secretary of State. I don't think it's any secret that this is a job that Chris Coons has wanted, so it's not surprising. He's gotten reviews or commentary from Joe Lieberman, who commented positively on his foreign policy experience, but Joe Lieberman is someone who is quite the hawk and warmonger, someone who's known to have taken money from defense contractors and helped them get contracts. So if that's someone who is giving a positive review of your ability to perform that job, like, I'm not sure that that's the model that I want to see for Secretary of State. I would much rather see someone who's not going to advocate for war with Iran in response to Saudi oil fields being bombed. Chris Coons has voted against the initial bill to end our funding of the Saudi-led genocide in Yemen. He has failed to stand up for Palestinian rights. And while a lot of people will say, yes, he has foreign policy experience, like, is that the experience we want? Do we want someone in the role of Secretary of State who has been hawkish and advocated for war repeatedly? I think the other thing that's incredibly important here is that he's currently running for re-election as a senator. And I think that we should really be pushing him to answer whether he's going to serve out that role. Because if he's running for another 6-year term, but intends to take a cabinet position in a Joe Biden presidency, then what will happen is that party powers will choose a replacement, and we'll have Jess had done an election if he were to win the election, and he'll be replaced by someone who the voters of Delaware did not choose. So I think it's incredibly important that he have to actually speak to that and say, you're running for re-election. Are you planning on actually serving out this term? I think that there's also an element of concern from the fact that as a heir of Gore and being heavily invested in Gore stocks, there's a prospect for Senator Coons to actually make money off of war, as Gore is actually a military contractor themselves. So there's a bit of conflict there from my perspective of, someone with that investment becoming Secretary of State as well. All right, let's see what's next. All right, so Kyler asks a question here on the topic of schools. How do we lower class sizes? How do we help to apply the school lunch program to times of quarantines? And how do we increase teacher retention outside of teacher pay? All right, so class sizes. Not easily, but one of the ways is having more teachers. Another way is being able to actually respond to the growth of a district. So often what happens is if a district grows and the school is actually not in a position to handle the number of students, just from a physical building capacity standpoint, classroom sizes balloon because there aren't actual different classrooms to put students in. I grew up with that experience. I told the story of how I literally took classes sitting on heaters, like in the back of the room. I was sitting on the radiator because there weren't enough desks in the classroom that I was in with 30 other kids. I tried to learn physics sitting in a room that was angled in a way that my seat couldn't actually see the board. So these things have been happening for decades. We've been underfunding schools for decades, and that was just a constraint of the building itself. So we need to, kind of going back to what I was saying before, we have to make sure that schools are able to fund infrastructure needs as their district changes. So more teachers, hiring more teachers, having the ability to change configurations of buildings to address capacity. How do we help apply school lunches during times of quarantines? That's a really great question. So a lot of schools, I think, have tried to do this really well, but some of them had a centralized point where they were saying that families had to come to them to be able to get food. And also they were requiring the students be present, which seems a little counterintuitive when you want to be in contact with as few people as possible. Like I would think that we can find a way to deliver meals without having to get kids to come to the pickup point. I also think that we would need to do mobile drop-offs, so actually bringing things to people, because if you are a parent who doesn't have a car, or thinking of Wilmington in particular, a lot of students are going to schools that are like 20, 30 minutes away. If you're not able to get out to that school to get the meals for your child, you're not going to be able to take advantage of that program. So I think is thinking about ways that we can better bring the food to children or to families, and in creating more mobile sites so that it's more dispersed rather than having like large centralized places, as well as not actually requiring the student to be there, I think would be some improvements. And then how do we increase teacher retention outside of increasing teacher pay? I mean, teacher pay, obviously very important. We want to make sure that teachers are being compensated well for the work that they're doing. I think that the other thing we have to look at is the cost of education to become a teacher. We're talking about a job that requires advanced degrees and certifications, and that becomes incredibly expensive. And then if you go through this expensive schooling to get a job that doesn't pay you enough to pay back those loans, that's why we get situations where teachers are working 2 and 3 jobs just to get by. So when we make college education free, I believe that will increase the amount of people who are becoming teachers and make it easier for them to also stay teachers. I also think we really have to think about the autonomy that teachers have in their classroom. And right now, there are some who feel really hamstrung by the programs that are in place. So when we talk about things like testing and Common Core and these things that have happened for a generation, No Child Left Behind, or not a generation, 20 years now, these changes have really made it so that teachers have less freedom, and they are in a position where they're really teaching to a test rather than teaching to the growth of a student. And I think that is something that seems to burn teachers out quite a bit. Not feeling like they can be creative and do their jobs the way that they have been trained to do them. I've heard this story from someone who talked about how a student of theirs was below grade level in math. And they were trying to teach them something on grade level. But because of how far behind the student was, they were not going to be able to get the grade level concept. So that teacher was trying to get them up to speed with the lower level concepts so that they could actually work on grade level. But that teacher was reprimanded for doing that because they weren't teaching to the proper curriculum. That is something that makes teachers just want to throw up their hands and say, well, what am I supposed to do here? Because the answer then is just to ignore that student and leave them in the back of the classroom drowning, ignoring what's going on because they can't actually follow. And that is not teaching. That is not what most people get into the profession of teaching to do. They want to be able to help that student. I think we have to reintroduce the actual flexibility to allow teachers to do their job and walk away from a lot of this really strict testing and get back to figuring out how do we actually educate and how do we actually develop students. Because I'd rather see teachers be able to show growth in their students, not just proficiency. Like, yes, we want to get to proficiency, but if you're in a classroom where your students are starting low on proficiency and you can do 40 points of growth in proficiency for the year, that's a much more impressive jump than you started with a class that was performing really well and you kept them performing really well. There's something to be said about how teachers who can bring students along and bring them up to grade level. And I think those are the things that teachers, from what I hear, actually enjoy doing in their work. So I think by getting them back to being able to do the work that they are trained to do, we can increase retention. All right, so another question. how will we go about bringing public utilities throughout the U.S. back into public ownership? Situations like PG&E, which is a power company, particularly out west, being allowed to pay out to shareholders instead of paying to fix their electrical systems and causing fires shouldn't be able to happen anymore. Yes, completely agree. So just a little background here. A lot of us receive our utilities, whether that's water, electricity, gas, through private companies. They are regulated, but they're still private companies. They have boards, they have shareholders, and those shareholders want to see returns on their investments. So that means that these companies are trying to turn a profit on the utilities that we need to, frankly, survive: water, electricity. So what ends up happening, like Maggie suggests in her question, is things like upkeep and maintenance potentially get ignored in favor of being able to make a return to shareholders. And this is core to the issue with so many companies, is that when you only prioritize quote unquote shareholder value, you're ignoring so many of the other stakeholders that exist in a company. You're ignoring employees, you're ignoring your customers, you're ignoring the environment, you're ignoring the community that you operate in. And you're solely focused on getting shareholder value, getting dividends back to them and payouts back to them, increasing the value of that share. Obviously, that doesn't serve the public well. And I think when it comes to utilities, it's particularly problematic. It's the same thing when we were talking about hospitals before. Like, what do you exist to do? And if we're talking about an electric company, we should be talking about what I would like to see are companies that exist to deliver electric utility in the cleanest way possible and the safest way possible and most efficiently for people and with the most consistency so that people don't have outages. So with PG&E in particular, they've really been blamed for fires that have happened out west and not necessarily held accountable for that. So I believe that we really should be, as part of things like the Green New Deal and pushes toward addressing climate change head on, we really should be looking at legislation that factors in transition. I think this goes even beyond electric companies. I think this should apply to oil companies as well. We need to take these things into control of the public so that we can make decisions in favor of the public and also allow the federal government and the public to wind these companies down if they need to be, like oil companies, who we should be ending our dependence on fossil fuels. We should be powering our electrical grid from other sources, but it's going to be very challenging just to get companies who solely exist to make money off of oil to do that on their own. And when you put a transition plan in place, you can actually transition workers as well. Because if you don't have that in place, what will happen is that those workers will be left out to dry. When we're looking at, just to continue on oil companies for a bit, when we're looking at the beginning of May, late April, and the price of oil went negative, if that continues and we continue to have this glut of oil and the prices, the bottom of prices falling out, those companies will lay off workers. Workers have already been laid off. They'll shut down operations, and we won't have the ability to protect workers from the most harm that will be done. And again, the wealthy shareholders and the people in power will ensure that they profit off of that shutdown while workers get left behind. So by transitioning these things to public ownership, we can actually take care of workers as well. All right, what's up? So David makes a comment that housing prices in Wilmington seem to have gone up a lot in 2020. And he says he knows that it's closer to Philly, but the same house in Dover can be half the price. Yeah, I mean, this is housing prices across our state, not just in Wilmington or just in Newcastle County, are really high, frankly. Not just homes either. We're talking apartments, rentals, condos. Everything here is pretty high, particularly given our median household income. Our median household income is about $60,000. So we're looking at people that if that's two people working, making about $30,000 a year. This is a huge part of why we need to ensure that everyone is receiving fair wages and wages that will actually ensure that they can survive. This comes back to the thing I say a lot. We absolutely need to be taking actions that guarantee a dignified standard of living to every single person. And the cost of housing is a huge factor in that. If you've heard me talk at all, you've probably heard me say that to afford a 1-bedroom apartment comfortably in our state, on average, you need to make $18 an hour. That's the wage that if you were receiving that wage, you could afford that home and not be rent burdened, not be spending too much of your income on your housing costs. But if we go back to what I just said about median household income, if that's two people working, they're making about $15 an hour. So if it's only a single person making $30,000 a year, we know that wage needs to be higher to afford housing in our state. So we also have to focus on the housing stock that we have. I believe that we need to expand federal investment in housing. I've said before, homelessness is a problem that can be solved with $20 billion. $20 billion is what we increased the military budget with without anybody batting an eyelash at the end of last year. The money is there. We have to prioritize investing it in the right place. So that's dealing with homelessness. Then we deal with people who are rent burdened or can't find housing that they can afford. And when we actually invest in increasing that housing stock, that is what will help people be able to feel a little more stable in their housing, feel like they're not being overwhelmed by the cost of that housing, because we can build things that are rent controlled. We could build things that are focused on being low income or affordable housing. Right now, we have people who qualify for federal assistance for housing. It can take years to actually get that assistance. And then when you do finally get it, you can't find a place to use it because there are so few homes available to be able to use that assistance. So we absolutely need to increase the stock of housing and focus on making sure that we aren't just relying on private developers or, frankly, private development to create housing, because we've seen that it's the private sector real estate developers are not investing in that lower income affordable housing range. They are investing in the much higher luxury side and creating housing that doesn't necessarily meet the needs of the vast majority of people that live in our state. So if they are not going to be the ones to make that investment, then the public has to be the ones to make that investment and ensure that the housing stock that's available actually meets the needs of the community. So Eric posted a question or a comment and a question of along the lines of schooling. My youngest brother has autism and my mother has had to read law books and quite literally fight with schools in order to get him the proper help and education he needed in order to live a normal life. How do we help special needs children in our schools when it's such an adversarial system? First, particularly in Delaware, schools need more funding. We don't have adequate funding for students with special needs. There's a federal program, IDEA funding, IDEA, that has not been fully funded as either. So there's money that should be coming from the federal government that has not been properly allocated. So schools are left without that funding for students with disabilities. But that's not the only answer. Like Eric is talking about with his mom having to read law books, the resources need to be more readily available for people to actually be able to know what their rights are, their students' rights are. We know students have a right to education, but we know that things like inadequate funding, inadequate services, inadequate staffing actually prevent them from being able to fulfill that right, particularly in an equitable way. So we need to sort of change the availability of those resources. This is a place where we should have a role that is focused on being like a parent advocate and student advocate in schools, so that it's not on the parent themselves to try to learn the law or get legal representation to fight for what their student deserves. Like that should be a resource that's provided by the school itself. That should be a position whose role it is to ensure that every student is actually being able to get the education they need and the services they need. Because while thankfully for his brother, Eric's mom was able to do this work, there are a lot of people who aren't able to do that. And a lot of parents who won't be able to figure that out for whatever reason that may be. So we need someone who's going to actually take charge and be the advocate on the behalf of the student in every single school. Just scrolling through some questions here. So Kyler had a follow-up question about how do we fund investment in a medical economy? How do we plan to structure our medical credentialing programs to support that? I'm not exactly sure about the credentialing programs part. I think that's probably a good conversation for me to have with people who are a little more well-versed in that. So if there's anyone you can recommend I speak to, I think that'd be a great conversation to have, because I'm not exactly sure where those programs are falling short right now. So I think that's something that I would love to spend more time and figure out. When it comes to investing in the infrastructure of hospitals and medical centers, I think that we have to be, it shouldn't necessarily be like this every man for himself type system that we have right now. The current economy that hospitals and medical centers operate in is that each individual one is trying to raise its own money, potentially in competition with another hospital, potentially in competition with other medical centers throughout a state or across state lines. And they're basically fighting over resources to try to fund the projects that they want to do, whether that's a capital project, meaning like actually building something, or whether it's creating a new research lab or hiring different types of doctors that have different types of specialties, whatever that might be. Kind of getting back to what I was saying before, like those are things that we can do in a more formulaic way, so that we actually can say, in northern Delaware, there's quite a bit of cancer. Let's make sure that there's a cancer center there that can deal with these things, so that people don't have to, while they're sick, be traveling to Johns Hopkins or up to UPenn or wherever it may be to get care. So we can make more decisions on a more global level that actually allocate dollars to where they're needed, rather than having this sort of fight that exists for those dollars right now. We could also be using more of a grant type system, federal grant system, so that hospitals essentially just when they have a capital project, rather than having to go out to private individuals or most often extremely wealthy individuals and try to fund it that way, they could be doing that through federal grants. All right. LeVar asked a question of how do you feel about teaching generational wealth and or more asset management classes in high school? I think it's hard for poor people to generate wealth if they have to get to college to learn how to do so. Yeah. So that's a really great question. I think part of the issue there, particularly when it comes to something like generational wealth, is that people who have the benefit of generational wealth have had the benefit of that being built in the generations before them. It's easy to make money when you have money. Your money makes money for you. It's much harder to make money when you have to labor to make that money. So I think it goes beyond even just learning how. We have a economy and that frankly perpetuates wealth inequality right now. I believe that we need to institute a wealth tax and bring back the estate tax, because what is happening is that we continue to perpetuate these issues from generation to generation, where some families or groups have built up wealth that just will essentially never dissipate because they have so much money that the fact that it's just even modestly invested, it can create so much more wealth that their spending never even touches the principle of the money that they had. So generation after generation that continues to expand, and there's really no catching up to that if you come from a family of working people who make money from their labor rather than make money from their money. So there's absolutely like federal changes that need to happen to actually fight back against wealth inequality. That being said, I do think that there's something that should be done around educating people on, frankly, how that system works. Because not only just like how do you buy stocks, but I think it's important that we do shine a light on the inequality that our system creates and get away from the conversations that, I always heard, which were if you work hard, you'll make it. Because a whole lot of people work incredibly hard and they don't make it. They continue to work hard for wages that they can't survive on. They work hard and work for someone who doesn't even offer them a 401k, so they can't even invest. They work hard and maybe they do invest, but lose everything at the wrong time because of another recession. So I think we have to actually do education around that myth of this idea of like working your way to wealth, because most of the people who are wealthy have not necessarily worked for those individual dollars. But I do also think that there is an importance to explaining. In high school, it does seem like that's the right place to sort of break down what are these things that we're even talking about. When we say stocks and bonds and when we talk about stock markets and Federal Reserve markets, because the fact that the knowledge about those things is held by a limited set of people perpetuates the system. When people don't know about the sort of like rigged nature of our economy, they can more easily buy into the myth that they just have to work hard. I think that it should be part of education to like speak to the fact that what are these vehicles of wealth and how do they work and who uses them and how do they use them? Because I think that will start to shine a light on some of the things that are really wrong with our economy. And I hesitate to push toward things like, financial literacy education. I think that, in some cases there is good intentions behind that. But in other ways, I think that often when we're talking about ways to help poor people or working poor, we hear, oh, well, financial literacy classes will help them. But I never hear that directly from a poor person themselves. What they say will actually help them are higher wages and working for companies that offer pensions so that it's not just on the individual to figure out how to fund their own retirement. Um, Working for companies that actually give workers a stake and are more like a co-op where workers share in the profits and productivity that they create. Those are the things that will actually help working people. So I do hesitate to say that like we should just have financial literacy classes in high school. I don't think there's harm in it, but I don't think it solves the problem, I guess is kind of what I'm getting at. Because financial literacy is great, but if you still don't have a job that gives you wages that are high enough to cover your bills every month and save money for an emergency and save for your retirement and save for your kids' college, like these are all the things that actually make it hard for people to build wealth. So even if you're literate about these vehicles, if you're not making enough money, you can't take advantage of them. So I think it's important to sort of pair those bits of education and then layer on ensuring that we continually fight for raising the wages of working people. Sorry, getting a bit of a drink. Yeah, so then last question here, probably a couple minutes left. Yes, so question was, speaking of generational wealth, raising the estate tax. Yeah, absolutely. No question. Oh, like, I don't even know that I need to get into this. Like, there should absolutely be a much higher estate tax because that will actually help close the gap of massive wealth inequality in our country. There should be a wealth tax on extreme wealth because earning an extreme income is frankly an antisocial behavior. And I don't mean antisocial in the sense of like you're an introvert. I mean like it's anti our society. It's bad for society to have some people making extremely high incomes and some people making extremely low incomes. So that's frankly why higher tax rates actually disincentivize making that extreme wealth. If you're going to make millions and millions of dollars, but you're going to be taxed at 90%, then you're not going to likely want to actually make that level of wealth every year or level of income every year. So that is the argument for higher tax rates. It actually creates a more, not only just a more equal society, but a society where like some individuals are not solely focused on making as much money as possible because it's actually not as good for them to do so. So not only estate tax, but absolutely higher tax rates on the highest incomes. All right. Well, it's about 8:30. Thank you all for joining me. This is, the highlight of my Mondays. As always, if you're able to support our campaign, one great way to do that is by making a donation at justfordelaware.com/donate. If you're able to support our campaign with volunteer time, in some ways that's even better. You can become one of our phone bankers that is making phone calls for us every day between noon and 9 every day. And you can sign up to do that at justfordelaware.com/volunteer. So hope to see you do that. Would love to have you join the team. You get to come to the team meetings. We get to talk. I'm in Slack. I'm phone banking, sharing the stories about what I hear from voters. I like to think we're a pretty likable group, good team. So we'd love to have you join us. In the meantime, stay safe this week and let us know if there's anything you need or any other questions you have. Thanks so much. Bye.